Good evening, everyone. As this story goes, I get a call from Christina, and she says, Bob, I understand you sell properties in New York City. I have a client that may want to sell some properties. We'd like to talk to you. Why should we use you to sell the properties? And I said, well, one reason. And I've been brokering in New York City for 35 years. As of this past Monday, I've sold 1,876 buildings in New York City. And the reason I've sold so many buildings is because I only represent sellers, and my only goal in life is to get the highest possible price for the people I represent. As an intermediary, I think it's very odd how brokers will represent buyers and sellers because they're two people with completely different objectives in the marketplace. I only represent sellers. And why do I do that? Is because I have a very bad memory. I never want to remember what I say to anybody. I just want to always try to be getting the highest price I possibly can. So Christina calls me and she says, Bob, we want you to help us out. We'd like you to come in and talk about what you can do to maximize value here. And we went through that process, got hired, I think got a very good result. But I think what I'd like to talk to you about tonight is some macro things, not specifically about these transactions, but about the marketplace in general and about the risks that are involved in the market today. And also talk about whether, if you own property in New York, should you sell it? As I said, I've been brokering for 35 years. For 36 years, or 34 years of the 35 years, I always told people, do not sell property you own in New York. And people would look at me and say, wait a second, Bob, you're a guy who makes your living based upon people selling. Why are you telling me not to sell? And there were two reasons why I did that. One was because I really didn't want to work for anybody that really was on the fence about whether they wanted to sell or not. So I said, don't sell. If I told them not to sell and they were on the fence, they probably wouldn't sell. The other reason was that the reality is that the peak of every cycle in New York City over the past 50 years has greatly exceeded the value peak of the previous cycle. So if you held on, you did better. So it really did make sense. For the past year, I have not been telling people to hold. And the reason is that the landscape in New York City real estate has changed very, very significantly. What are those changes? Well, there now are new risks in the market that we didn't have before. One is market risk. Market risk in that with technology the way it is today, things move so quickly. I remember back in 1987, October of 87, the stock market crashed. The real estate market wasn't impacted by that until 1990. But today, the way information flows so quickly, things happen at a much greater rate. There's market risk in terms of changes to the market, things that can happen, the quickness with which things move. So that market risk is very, very tangible. Secondly, and most importantly, we now have political risk unlike anything I've seen. Political risk recently, June 14th, the rent regulation laws in New York City were changed. With the stroke of the governor's pen, hundreds of billions of dollars was vaporized in the New York City multifamily real estate market. That can happen in anything. This change, these legislative changes have impacted the multifamily market, but there's talk about retail rent control. Let's talk about commercial rent control that would impact office buildings. Who knows what the next thing that politicians are going to get on is going to change the market. So political risk is very, very significant. Third risk, regulatory risk. It seems like every month or two there are new requirements for property owners in terms of what they're going to do with their properties from an environmental perspective, from a renting perspective, the way you manage, the things you have to file with the city. So the regulatory risks have become very, very significant. So these risks didn't exist before. And so with that as the backdrop, why should you sell a property in New York today? Three main reasons. Number one, there are higher yields outside New York. As much as the background is more risk intensive today than it has been in the past, the rate of return on properties in New York City is still very, very low relative to around the rest of the country. So if you sell a property in New York, you can arbitrage that into a much higher return somewhere else. And perhaps, at least as past history has shown us, you might not get the same rate of appreciation on that asset if you buy it in Philadelphia or DC or Florida or Texas, but your cash flow is going to be significantly higher. So if you are a generational owner and want to own that asset long term, you don't care about a price appreciation, you care about cash flow. So reason number one to do it is because cash flow outside New York is much higher than it is in New York. And I'm not saying that New York is not a great place. I believe New York is the greatest city in the world. Fortunately, people still want to come live and work here, and I'm very bullish on New York, but there are reasons why people are leaving. Second risk, or the second reason why people are selling assets in New York, is that the management intensity of managing properties today is very, very significant here. All the paperwork and regulatory environment you have to deal with requires a lot of elbow grease to manage properties and extract cash flow from them. A lot of clients I have want to get out of the management business and into the depositing check business. So they'll buy a net lease property somewhere in probably a state that has no state income tax, which are the economies that are growing the fastest, that economically are doing the best, and just buy a triple net lease property where they're just depositing a check once a month instead of having to worry about a broken toilet or a broken window or any of the other millions of things that can go wrong from a management perspective. And thirdly, and most importantly, diversification is so needed today because of all the risks that I mentioned. I have a client who is a third-generation multifamily property owner. His grandfather started the business. He has a portfolio now that's worth about $2 billion, or at least before January 14th was worth $2 billion. There was about $1 billion in debt on that portfolio, so this 37-year-old guy was worth $1 billion on June 13th. On June 14th, he was worth $400 million. And he, to his credit, said, you know what, Bob, I'm totally cool with that because thanks to my grandfather and my dad, I'm in a good spot. But I shouldn't have had 100% of my assets in New York City multifamily real estate. What the heck were we thinking? I should have bought some office buildings. I should have bought some retail. I should have bought in Philadelphia. I should have bought in Florida. I should have bought in Texas or wherever. And that diversification, not having all your eggs in one basket, is so critical because if you have all your eggs in one basket, with the stroke of a pen, your life can change. And with the way the world is today, I think you want to be diversified with your holdings. You want to be product type diversified. You want to be geographically diversified. And so looking at potentially selling New York properties now is a much more beneficial thing to be thinking about than it has been in the past. For the family that we sold these properties for, they were probably the type of properties, these were 100% rent-stabilized buildings. They are probably the type of property that is most adversely affected by the changes in the law. These properties sold at a 2% cap rate, meaning the rate of return to the buyer was 2%. Today, they probably would be 6%. That's probably an 80% drop in value. Based on the stroke of a pen, based on what some legislator thought should happen, having nothing to do with market fundamentals. Those risks are significant. I always said, don't sell New York City real estate. Today, it's something to think about. If any of you own property and want us to do a valuation, I'm happy to do a valuation at no cost or obligation to you. But understanding what your portfolio is worth and how you might be able to increase your cash flow through taking advantage of the professionals up here is something you absolutely should think about today. Thanks.
Thank you.